You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Seeking the Hidden Thing podcast. It is my pleasure to have Todd Lewis on Praise of Folly. Welcome, Todd.
Oh, well, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and I thought it would be good to have a conversation with you, in part because I was listening to a stream or recording that you did with Academic Agent last week or 2 weeks ago, and in it, you mentioned something that I had never really considered, but once you say it out loud is obvious. And I think, not to say that you guys didn't talk about it, but AA didn't give it the kind of weight that I think it really deserves. And then, interestingly enough, Benjamin Boyce did an interview with Nick Land that talked about Spandrel's trichotomy on the right. And it all of a sudden kind of clicked, because in the end, even though a lot of Spandrel's analysis about sort of the way of things and so forth, how the sort of the current regime constitute itself and so forth, his analysis about, or his pleas at the end of the video that the various three groups of the right have to work together, I immediately thought about your comment and thought that's not going to work. And essentially what you made the assertion is that there is no right-wing Marx. And I think this is fundamentally correct. And this might be one of the core problems that the right has. So maybe you want to flesh that out for the audience, Todd, and sort of just explain a little bit about what that means, and then we can kind of see where that goes from there.
Yeah, that sounds great. So first of all, I've been following, left politics as someone on the right, for the last 25 years, because it's knowing your enemy. It's knowing what's going on the other side. You don't want to leave yourself stuck in a bubble, right? So on the one hand, I do follow these people, and I have followed them for a very long time. The one thing that I noticed was that this might be less true now, but I think it still is true. The idea that even though the left has this broad palette of different factions that are on it, they all sort of default to a kind of Marxian wavelength when they look at. So, for example, one of the things is the big original story was the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, oppresses the proletariat. All other of the left's oppressive narratives, whether it's whites over blacks or men over women or cis people over, non-cis people, all of this is a derivative of that structure of thought of oppressor oppressed. Now, whether or not that's a logical or necessary deduction from Marx is another question. It is the case that this is what these people do. And so what happens is, eventually, if somebody with a loud enough bullhorn says Marx, they'll all start forming what's called the Popular Front. So we saw this in Spain in the 30s, where all the leftists get together and they form a solid front, from left liberals to Stalinists. And that was the Popular Front in Spain. And of course, what do they rally around? Well, they not only Marxist thought, but Marx's eschatology of the future, of this, world where you are liberated. What did Marx say? In a communist society, you'll be able to fish in the evening, read during the afternoon, and do whatever you want, right? And that's sort of this whole political ideology, economic analysis, and eschatology all rolled up into one. And all these other groups at least participate in it to some extent. And so that can then tie them together to form united political fronts. Now, on the right, the closest thing we've ever seen to that in modern times was Franco. He was able to tie together the fascist elements, the monarchist elements, the Catholic elements in Spain to win the Civil War. But that, I think, has more to do with Franco's political acumen and charisma rather than any sort of inherent rightist philosophy or ideology.
Like the more power at work than ideas.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can't count on that kind of guy to appear whenever the crisis comes. Whereas the left has a built-in ideological framework that they can default to in these crisis moments and create a united front. The right doesn't have that. Now, why? I mean, there's a lot of reasons. One, I think you could argue, is that since the Enlightenment, the political right has been in retreat. It's lost control of the institutions of higher education. It's lost, and then from there, it's lost political control, and its military defeats on the battlefield. Also, right-wing thinkers tend not to be as systematic as these leftist critiques. You got Marx, but you've also got people like Baudrillard. You've got, even like Foucault and Derrida for like the postmodernists. They have more what we might call global critiques of the situation. So they look at the big picture and then they work their way down. Whereas rightist thinkers in the last few hundred years don't do that. They tend to have a more subjective interpretation of the world around them. Right? They're not. So, for example, Marx, right? Material conditions are objective. We're going to understand material conditions and then work out something from there. Whereas, with many of the right thinkers, it's about the individual perspective of the writer, right? Or it's about some sort of an emotional feeling. And now anarchists are kind of like that too. But, the idea, so if you think like the propaganda, the deed of the anarchists, act and don't think. Well, ideologically, there's a connection between anarchists and fascists with not Frantz Fanon, that was the different guy. But through the syndicalist movement, branches into fascism in Italy and then anarcho-syndicalism in Spain. And that's with Georges Sorel. But the point is, though, they tend to have a more subjective or emotive point from which they start talking about their philosophy. So, for example, Evola is very introspective and more emotion and inward oriented than, say, a Marx, who's more, outward oriented and then working in from, material conditions.
And it's esoteric in a sense too. Like Evola is very esoteric, and when you look, even just looking down the list of book titles and so forth, you can tell that you're wandering off the sort of the beaten path, so to speak.
Right. The only rightist thinker that I've really seen that is appealed to from the past in these circls that has a more universal perspective is Spengler. Right. Spengler would come closest. And of course, Spengler does engage with Marx as well as a thinker. But Spengler's giving you a theory of history. Marx is doing much more than that. Marx is not only giving you a theory of history, he's giving you an eschatology, he's giving you a theory of economy. And so he really is like this prophet on the left that has multiple levels of his thought, his eschatology, the communist state, the end of history. You've got the economic analysis, you've got the analysis of history. Nobody on the right has all of those elements in one theory or one philosophy. And because of that, you have to then rely on charismatic figures to unite them, and they're not very common.
No, and I think in some ways it maybe goes even deeper than that. And two authors that I know of, and it's probably others have noted the same. I know that Schmidt, in the tail end of I think it's The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, does this sort of, in the middle of the book, does this kind of weird analysis of Marx, and you think kind of like what's going on. But he's, in a sense, he's laying the groundwork for answering the question of why violence is probably the only answer to modernity in that regard, right? And so what he makes the case, so what Schmidt makes the case is that so the bourgeoisie intellectual likes the idea of Marx because he's critical of some of the things, the excesses he sees of the emerging industrial system, the emerging, bourgeoisie capitalist system. He's critical of it, and he's thinking about this. And so when Marx introduces his theory, it kind of appeals to him. But the problem is that Marx's theory doesn't leave any real room for the bourgeoisie. In a sense, the intellectual himself, who is attracted to theory, has no real room. And so there's this question of, well, how are the working classes going to gain enlightenment of their own condition and develop that sort of, what's the term that Marx, but where the revolutionary consciousness, right? And so it in theory, I guess it's supposed to just sort of emerge spontaneously via the historical circumstances will bring it about. But that's not good enough for the intellectual. So the bourgeoisie, in a sense, has to take it upon himself to educate the working class man in order to raise his consciousness about his own condition. And Augusto del Noce notes a similar thing where he talks about how the bourgeoisie, in a sense, neutered Marx by taking Marx on board, and instead of cleansing it of its eschatological or its more religious thing, and in a sense taking sort of the managerial skills of the bourgeoisie and say, instead of sweeping away the present order, we can manage our way to the Marxist utopia. And so then you have this thing where Marx is now absorbed into the mainstream. And in a sense, the mainstream in many ways welcomes it, because fundamentally, and this is something that Ellul notes, is that one of the foundational ideas of Western modernity is this notion of human progress, that we are advancing as a society. So, you have the whole reframing of the Dark Ages and then the Enlightenment, and now you have the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and everything is getting better and better. And with it, you have a supporting kind of cosmology, which is then Darwinian, survival of the fittest that way, and evolution and so you're bringing all of these ideas together. And so there is a kind of natural affinity. And then also the materialism, as you're pushing aside the old world of sacramentalism and the mystery that was embodied in medieval Christianity, and you're replacing it with the rationalism of Protestantism, and then sort of the capitalism, industrialism, and so forth. And so you end up with a world that is progressive, is looking towards a brighter future all the time, and seeing science and technology as an integral part of that. Well, Marx and like Hegel and Marx, in this sense, are almost the perfect philosophies for this type of environment. And now you also then have a kind of thing where the enlightened bourgeoisie philosopher can now feel good about, helping the poor and the downtrodden. And we're going to manage our way. We're going to engineer society for this better and better and better future. And so you can see, in a sense, where kind of a version of sort of Marxist thinking begins to take over everything. And so in this regard, when you look at that sort of spandrel trichotomy between the techno-futurist, right, and then you have what was the other one? It's the sort of the critics of the left, and then there's sort of the religious group, and I'm trying to forget what the third.
They're called the theonomists of the religious group, and then I think
the theonomist,
the patriarchy, right? The manosphere, right? Wasn't that it?
It's the nationalists. It's the blood and soil type of nationalists, and then the techno-futurists, right? And in many ways, you can see kind of the blood and soil nationalism also takes on a kind of progressive character. Like, even in many respects, the Third Reich was a kind of progressive ideology in a sense. We're not so much making bringing the West a thing, but the German people are going to arise, and we're going to instantiate this glorious 1,000-year reign. So you have this kind of eschatological, utopian, forward-thinking, technocratic understanding of the future of the German people, right? And so you can see then too, where in some ways there's like, even with Make America Great Again, with MAGA, there is this sense of like, well, things have gotten off track. Well, what's gotten off track? Well, it's the progress for the American people is now off track. And so we have to cleanse aside all of this DEI and all of this woke nonsense and get back on track again towards instantiating, progress and economic and technological progress, which then dovetails nicely into the the techno-futurist side of the so-called right. But those two factions, in many ways, really align themselves with the core foundations, these core myths of Western modernity. So in many ways, both of these could broadly be said to be, in some sense, almost loosely speaking, Marxist in the way that the neoliberal is a Marxist. That in a sense, they have the same structure over. The only one that really is in some ways different would be the theonomist, in a sense, because he's kind of backwards looking and downscale, and people don't know what to do with it, right? And so if you look at, so the theonomist, he has a text, it's the Bible, but nobody wants to look at, no serious right-minded person sort of is going to do their politics based on the Bible. That's just, you're like, ha, 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 right? That's for country bumpkins. So instead, well, what do you do? Then you grapple on, Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli. That's what the smart people do. So you can see on the right then sort of the resurgence in digging into Plato, Marx, Machiavelli, or not into like Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, and then, some of the other medieval and older philosophers in a sense. But you're not really, there isn't really a right-wing thinker that can bind those groups again in opposition to this notion of human progress. I mean, Spengler doesn't do it in a sense because he's pessimistic. He's just basically telling you, like, listen, the West is going to collapse. There's nothing you can do about it. Optimism is cowardice, right? And so, like, I mean, what kind of political vision is that? Like, nobody, I mean, okay, if you're a hardcore realist, you can grasp that, but I mean, nobody's going to vote for that. You know what I mean? It's not, or nobody's going to rise up in rebellion because Spengler said the West is going to collapse. And so that's, I think, sort of you get into this kind of fundamental problem of sort of, well, here's where we're at, and the people are opposed to the way that the current regime is going, but there's nothing to bind them in opposition that way. No, other than you might say like a singular personality, which I think maybe people hope Trump would be. But again, like you say, there isn't really a text out there that does that work.
Well, right. So for example, the idea of so genius can come, right? And we could argue that, say, Franco was an organizational genius who came together, united all the right-wing elements, and then won the Civil War. But what the right doesn't have, right, is let's call it a machine to generate greatness. So, for example, the German General Staff, which begins its life in the Napoleonic Wars, understands that military genius can be trained. It's not something you have to wait for. Now, Napoleon was a genius, and he was, of course, trained, but he wasn't trained to be a genius. He went to the French military academies, and his own genius was manifested as a result. They're like, well, no, we can create an organizational genius. And then once that got set up, down the line, all the other Western militaries copied that staff system. And, the left sort of has this with the idea of the party vanguard, right? Lenin creates the idea of the party vanguard so that you can raise the awareness, the class interest of the workers, so that they are aware of their conditions. And then you then supply them with the appropriate Marxist answers to those problems you've now made them aware of. And then you direct that. That's a whole closed loop, right? Lenin creates.
Yeah, and then as it gets taken up into the bourgeoisie, once they become aware of their condition, you can then point them to the engineering systems of the state as the instantiation of how that's going to get fixed.
Right. And so the thing is what the left has, right, is this already existing mechanism that, one, raises the consciousness of the individuals within the group, led by vanguard leaders, and then they then direct people to act in ways that they are told will improve their condition vis-a-vis where they're at now. The right doesn't really have anything like that. Now, the idea of a party vanguard isn't necessarily a leftist idea. That's how Islamist movements work. The Taliban works like that. That would be the, quote, theonomist faction in the Middle East, right? If we're going to use the trichotomy. But Islam was able to do this. Now, that's because they all rallied around the Quran and Allah and that stuff. Whereas in the United States, so you do have Christians, and so theoretically we could just point to Christ in the Bible, but then the right has a lot of non-Christians. and they're not going to go along with that. So what then would be the glue that holds that together?
Well, and I think even so, and I think this is where Nick Land's analysis earlier in his thing becomes very salient, is the observation that to make sort of modernity what it was, you needed a coming together of Protestants, of Jews, and capital. And in a sense, it was sort of Protestant rationalism, in a sense, with Jewish banking, money, and organizational skills, and combined with capital. And now you sort of have a marriage that allows spontaneously it gives the conditions for this to allow. So in many ways, Protestants, by tying themselves to money interests, undermine the, should I say, the purity of their faith interest. So in a sense, you've already subordinated your faith to the banking money interest as represented in the state system. Even if you maintain a theological or a moral conservatism, in practice, you've subordinated your efforts to the left, because now you've bought into the capitalist version of the glorious future. And I think that's really in many ways the thing that, because see, the Islamist is not necessarily tied into the capitalist world. And so he can have a purely religious vision of conquest. And I think that's why it works for Islam and it doesn't work for, say, American Protestants the same way.
Well,
if
okay,
that makes sense.
Yeah, the next thing then would be I think we can break this up into two sections. One is the trichotomy itself, and then also the elements in it, do they fit together? So the first thing I'm going to say is I just don't buy any of the things of the trichotomy. So first of all, Spandrel's trying to make an appeal to the three estates of the Middle Ages: those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, the clergy, the soldier, the knights, and the peasants. He aligns the nobility with the techno-commercialists. That's just, you can't
that doesn't square.
That doesn't work at all.
No.
I mean, a military caste of propertied soldiers, knights, are by definition the opposite class of the merchant elite. So this entire juxtaposition makes literally no sense. I don't know why you could say theonomists and clergy, that sort of makes sense. The nobility,
the theonomists and clergy would be the representative in some sense of the old aristocratic worldview in that regard.
No, but the second part of that makes no sense at all. I don't understand how that fits at all. And then the idea that the ethno-nationalists are the peasants, again, that this group is a series of thought leaders, right? They said they would be, their class would be intelligentsia, not peasants, because intelligentsia is someone who works with his mind and gets paid to think, So the actual thought leaders of the ethno-nationalist movement, both historically and presently, would be better classified as intelligentsia, not peasants. And so this whole bundled narrative to me just seems like a gimmick. Like, okay, there's a bunch of medieval files in the right, so we're gonna rope in the three estates, and except maybe for one, label them all wrong. And it's like this doesn't seem to have any coherency with what the idea of the three estates meant in Europe in the Middle Ages. This is just
no. Although, I think too, though, yes, I think you're right. Although at the same time, I think that in the predominant part of, and I'll put that video in the show notes just for people so they can watch it. I think fundamentally Land's analysis of the coming together of Jewish, Protestant, and capital interests, I think, is fundamentally correct. But I do think, even as I was listening to his division into theonomists, nationalists, and techno-futurists, as you say, seemed a little bit forced and not entirely accurate of sort of an accurate taxonomy of what is actually going on in the right presently today.
Well, yeah. Now let's go to the other point now, which is the analysis of capitalism that Spandrel gives, and that he's also picking up on now and using himself. I would strongly contest that. I mean, first of all, most of these people are libertarians, so they should be familiar with Rothbard's work, that it was the Spanish scholastics that were very influential in the rise of the market economy and market thought. And then this will be at the 16th, 17th centuries. And then in the 17th century, you have Pascal, who writes critically of Jesuit casuistry, specifically with regards to usury, which is considered the big capitalist bogeyman. And so, because Rothbard is writing in response to the general Weberian consensus of the Protestantism capitalism, the Protestant work ethic. Now, I think on the one hand, Rothbard might be overstating the case a bit, but he brings up quite a few good points. The Spanish scholastics, but furthermore, the commercial revolution, which is where the rise of capital starts. So let's say from 1100 to 1800, then that shifts into the Industrial Revolution. All the major elements begin in the Catholic world. You got the idea of modern banking, Venice, but the modern idea of banking begins in Florence.
That's right.
You have the idea of, and of course, the big challenge at the time was, how do you justify usury within the system that says usury is illegal? Well, in fact, E. Michael Jones, in his book about money, The Barren Metal, actually talks about how, it actually starts with Florence in the 1300s, and he covers like 200 years before Luther even gets to, the 95 Theses. And he says by this point, they'd already created all these loopholes. And then, of course, you can bring in the Spanish scholastics, who are also laying this down. And so everything that the Dutch would later pick up on, that's the next big. We got the Fuggers, the banking family in Germany. I think that the capitalist system, all the key elements that later develop, are all there with Catholic Europe. For example, in England, the Enclosure Acts began with Henry VII, Henry Tudor, and he's still Catholic. This is before Henry VIII. So all of these elements. Yeah. And the other thing, too, Nick Land wants to say that the Jews, they're conversos in Spain. Well, yeah, of course, you have a vested interest in saying you're Catholic when you're not, if you're going to go to the Inquisition. The thing is, though, the whole thing with the Benjamin Boyce interview was that there's this two-tiered system of truth. There's what's, true in the business world, and then there's what's true in reality. And they tie that into the Jewish conversos. But that's not the dynamic that Protestants had. They didn't pretend to convert to anything. Because what Nick Land is saying, that the Jews were being dishonest. They were pretending to convert to Catholicism when they really weren't. And that's where you get this two-tiered system of truth and capitalism. But in the Protestant Reformation, nobody was pretending to be Catholic and then saying, "Oh, psych, I'm actually not." I don't see that connection hold.
No, and I think the dynamic is slightly different in the Protestant world that way. Trying to put that around. I think the point being, the essential point there was the nature between having a high trust society, but yet at the same time a somewhat with consanguinity, like loose family relations, and then the thing that bound them together in both this sort of dichotomy or paradox between being both a high trust society and then with this sort of Calvinist idea of total depravity, that you can't trust anybody. And so what you need then is a system of law that would then regulate human behavior such that you can create a trustworthy system that isn't dependent upon the vagaries of human virtue or lack thereof. And the case was that, in a sense, the Jews found that to be an environment that was very amenable to them, because then you could lean on state power for protection, because the system, once it was fully imposed and integrated, created a thing where like pogroms just couldn't happen anymore because it violated the rule of law in that regard. And once this idea of the rule of law was so deeply instantiated. Now, the thing with Protestants is you're trying to juggle this sense of, on the one hand, you have, I think, where you would get sort of a masking type thing, is that everybody knows that seeking wealth is in itself unseemly as an end. And so you somehow have to manage it. So you end up in some ways, I think, splitting where, business is business and church is church in a sense. And so you begin to, in many ways, rationalize the faith more, where faithfulness becomes much more about having the right theology and the right ideas than it is. And as long as you're not outrightly immoral, so you're not sleeping with your neighbor's wife, or you're not, but when it comes to business, all of that just sort of gets elided. Nobody ever talks about that anymore, because I think so. You can still have a kind of conservative, faithful Christianity because you emphasize theology and a certain morality, but at the same time, you have this other piece, business, that's sort of and this is where you begin to abstract. Sort of business has its own rules, right? It's no longer about covenant relationships between a boss and his between people. Everything begins to get abstracted, and that's part of this the historical rise of the use of abstractions and greater abstraction in society and law and governance and so forth. That it allows you then to with Scottish utilitarianism sort of folded into the mix. It allows you to begin to say things where well, I have to let all these employees go because that's just, the way business works, right? I can't keep and so you begin to remove the moral obligation that's attached to business as capital begins to break free. And then part of the whole thing, and this is, I think, it starts, as you say, within, Venice, Florence, and then it gradually breaks out. And what it does is it pushes aside the kind of control, the social control that the Catholic Church had on capital. And then once the Protestant Reformation allows that capital sort of to reach escape velocity, where it then, with the addition of Protestant rationalism and the rationalism of the Enlightenment, to create a sort of an abstract system of economics that no longer answers the question of personal morality in a sense, am I doing my employees right? No longer becomes a question, rather than it's much more driven by, am I effectively making money? Well, if I'm not making money, I have to let my employees go, right? And it just seems logical to us today because that's kind of the system is done. But there was a period of time where that would have been seen as immoral to do that. And so it's one of these things, I think, and that's why in a sense it's, again, these things are like long historical developments, but at the right time, these elements come together. It ferments for, like 1,000 or 600-700 years. And then it emerges onto the historical scene and it's kind of ready to go. And, you combine it into an era, and this is like what Ellul says, you have social plasticity and then sort of a positive direction. And everybody's kind of ready for this idea of human progress. And everybody just kind of gets on board, whether it's social, political, economic. You have to have the market because that's how we reach utopia. You have to have, all, and then, so that's in a sense, you need science, you need to, and that's how technology and science and economics create or, achieve escape velocity is in a sense because of these sort of historical circumstances. I don't think it was ever done with sort of, nobody ever sat down and did it with malign intent. Like, this is the system and we have to design it. It was just more of, step by step, you end up getting to a spot where here we are. And this was the alliance that came together to make modernity what it is.
Well, okay, to keep going with this, because I think ultimately the trichotomy misframes things.
Sure.
The Puritans, see, this is where the right doesn't have a consistent perspective on the Puritans. On the one hand, you're going to hear what Nick Land said, that because they're Calvinists, they create this society which nobody can be trusted, and then you have to have this abstraction. But which was also like part of the U.S. Constitution is sort of an example of some of that, of that, being instantiated law. So anyways, go on. But at the same time, you're going to hear as an insult, puritanical, the idea that somebody wants to have a moral imposition on society. And, if you look at Puritan New England, it was a very high trust society. It was a society that was very cohesive. Mm-hmm. And so the insult that you get from those on the right is a reflection of that. So is it a high trust or a low trust society? The right can't seem to agree on it, because on one side of its mouth, it'll say it was, by insulting you as a Puritan who wants to get in my bedroom. And then the other time it's going to say, well, no, it creates a low trust society. Well, you can't be both. And right-wing thinkers.
Well, this is what Land says. It's a fundamental contradiction, right? So, and it doesn't get resolved. So the two things kind of are held together. But again, this is the kind of the problem that you get. The Marxists always talk about heightening the contradictions, right? So this is a sense of, I think, one of those fundamental contradictions because not enough attention was given to what creates a high trust society. And far more attention was given to creating the perfect system. And by working on creating the perfect system, you then completely erode everything that created the high trust society.
Well, okay, now let's go to this now. The idea of an abstract political system imposed from like the intelligentsia rather than a sort of organic bottom up, right? Well, if you look at political thought in Western Europe, say from the Reformation until Marx, we have the people that advocate for the utopian projects are Catholic thinkers. You've got Thomas More's Utopia. You've got Campanella's The City of the Sun, which are essentially centrally planned societies in this sort of utopian mold. And in fact, Marxists admit this as an inspiration for their work. Whereas the idea of the rule of law, this is another thing. A lot of the modern right just isn't engaging with classical thought. The idea of the rule of law is not the result of Jews in Spain suppressing their faith or necessarily Protestants in Western Europe. It's Greek and Roman, and it's that discovery in the Renaissance that leads to that discourse coming back into the political language. And so you have, in Scotland with John Knox or in New England with those people, the Puritans, they're not producing a rationally designed society. That's the Jesuits in Paraguay with the reductions. That's the rationally planned society, not the organic bottom up that we see in like say Scotland and New England or Switzerland. And so I would argue that the idea, if you're going to finger anybody for a rationally planned society, and by the way, the Marxists claim this. So Karl Kautsky claims that Thomas More was a predecessor for their line of thinking. And then Lenin erected a stela to the heroes of socialism in Moscow. And the first name on the list is Thomas More. They don't cite Protestants. They cite Catholics, specifically Catholics from a certain monastic utopian tradition. And I think that if we look at the Marxists themselves and their own self-identification, this seems to me to be a mismatch of cause and effect. They're well aware of the history, and they're like, no, we're not getting it from the Puritans. We're getting it from the Marxists themselves. Will tell you our idea of a rationally planned communist society is coming from by 1500 is coming from certain Catholic intellectuals and religious thinkers.
I don't disagree with that at all, but I do think that there is a sense where certain of these impulses, although they originate within the Catholic, I mean, prior to the 1500s, there was just, it wasn't even called Catholic, it was just Christian, right? And it really isn't until you have the break in the Reformation in the middle of the 1500s, the 1600s, and then during the religious wars, that there's sort of this kind of cross-fertilization. And I think that even if they're not taken up directly, that there were certain things that were germinated within the old Roman Church that found their flowering and their realization within the sort of, Western Protestant, technocratic, capitalist, environment. That was the space where, in a sense, social engineering comes into its own once you can cleanse it of its religious roots. And that really happens on the Protestant side of things and not so much on the Catholic. I think it's sort of an idea that gets taken up without necessarily proper attribution, so to speak. But I mean, because you begin to see it in, like, a good example is the Canadian context in the, the mid to late 1800s, where in early 20th century, where you have the rise of social gospel as and this is a directly, kind of utopian sort of idea. Like, all of this prosperity that industrialization is bringing, we need to use it to, in a sense, bring about heaven on earth. and bring about the 1,000-year reign of God's 1,000-year reign will come because we're going to engineer society with the excesses that material prosperity has brought to us. So these are the types of things where, like, the social gospel movement, really gives it a kind of a fire that it maybe didn't have, even though, that there's always been these Catholic movements have existed side by side. They just didn't have the kind of social dominance that once you get into sort of the American, the Anglosphere, it's like really interesting, because you get then also too, in the late 1800s, you have the whole like social democrat movement. So where I'm, my family roots are in the Netherlands. So then you get the rise of, say, Abraham Kuyper in the late 1800s, where you have a former Protestant minister who becomes prime minister of the country. Right. And part of the whole thing is they're not necessarily rejecting liberalism per se. They just reject sort of the radicalism of the French Revolution. Right. And so then, Germany has similar movements. And so many of these social democrat movements are a realization of the promise of, capitalism, industrialization, but then also this thing of socialism, of engineering society, that we can then solve, poverty and all the rest of it by means of the government and by means of social engineering. So, like, I don't disagree with you at all. I just think that there's a transference from one to the other.
Well,
that I'm not sure there's necessarily clear lines per se, and maybe there can be, but I think that the ideas just bounced from one to the other, and it was really, in the sense, the Protestants that took them up and sort of made them what they were in the late, the 19th and 20th century.
Well, I mean, there's a few points here. Prior to, there was the Great Schism between East and West, and the Orthodox thought doesn't have this kind of rationally planned society, unlike. But then furthermore, we've got liberation theology in Latin America. That's even more radical than the social gospel, and that's all Catholic. And the social
but it doesn't. That's in a sense more Marx. It doesn't have the kind of hard-nosed organizational skills that, in a sense, Anglo-Dutch German Protestants apply to it. You know what I mean? To socialism, it's just more. It's more of the radical side, where they just simply adopt Marxism with liberation theology, just basically wholesale in, the early 20th century up through the 60s. Sorry, I interrupted you.
But even in Germany, the Social Democrats are primarily a Catholic party.
Yeah, and it was different you're right, that's true. But it was different. I know, like, in the Netherlands, it was different. And in Canada and in England, it was different as well, too. So those were generally Protestants. I know it was the Presbyterians and the Methodists that came together in Canada to form the United Church. That was the other thing. And that was, in a sense, go ahead.
Yeah. Now you're we're both heavily influenced by Jacques Ellul too. I think also we need to step back, because this overall meta critique that we sort of share. Ellul was known as a Christian anarchist, and he pinpoints all of this happening with Constantine. And his essay, which is it's more of a short book, it's like 100 pages, called Anarchy and Christianity.
I didn't like Anarchy and Christianity. But anyways, go ahead.
And he goes into that. Now the argument, he doesn't use the term mega machine, which is from Lewis Mumford.
That's right.
But the idea is that the mega machine is the state, or in this case, the empire. And then the empire creates the conditions for capital growth, which then creates the conditions for industrial civilization. And the broader Ellulian critique is going to be that you go from the church embraces the empire, the mega machine. And in the 4th century AD, that's all it was. There was no capitalism yet. There was no industrial civilization yet. But this was the first step down that road, because once you have this mechanism in place that can create the conditions for the rise of capital and the rise of industry, and you have Christians already invested in it, it starts to create this splintered, fractured consciousness where you still want to say you're Christian and you want to defend the system, but then the system produces externalities, which then undermines the overall Christian message. And the Ellulian narrative would be that that's where this starts to go wrong. And then over the centuries, you then get this evolution towards technology.
Yeah, I know that the sense to it. I get where he's coming from too, but I think And then this would dovetail to also with, say, someone like de Jouvenel's argumentation that, power grows as a response to the need to fight ever better wars and ever bigger wars. In that sense, like that military power drives a lot of, and I think there's something to that. My problem with Ellul's analysis in that is basically comes down to his rejection of, I think, Romans 13 as an interpolation in Paul's letter to the Romans. And then you can basically, from there, you can disregard a proper role for the king in society that is, in a sense, God-given. And so the challenge I would have to Ellul is that power per se is not the problem. It's the misuse of it. And just because somebody misuses something because the world is sinful does not mean that the king is inherently a bad idea. I mean, God himself is described as, God the king. That's Psalm 145, right? I praise you, God the king. And it's not just my king, but just the king of kings, right? The Lord of lords. So there is, in a sense, I think that there is some problematic nature to Ellul. Now, on the other hand, too, I think there was something Ellulian about the early American experience, in a sense, where largely the New World society was created without an existing. I mean, the gentry were involved, but not to the degree that they were in Old World England. And you had many communities that were largely just commoners who came, shopkeepers, tradesmen, and they came, set up, and they ran their own affairs. And that had a profound historical shaping on the way that they saw the world. So there is a sense where if you have the right people together, that perhaps it is possible to organize a society without the need for a state. But then, they're even Ellul's, in a sense, in the modern world, like, well, what happens if you have a neighbor, like a neighboring nation or political entity that chooses to organize, and around centralized power, industrialization, and starts rolling, what I've called the tank problem. Well, this nation of shopkeepers and farmers and small businessmen has a problem on their hand that they have to deal with the fact that their neighboring, they have a neighbor who doesn't have the same, problems with this sort of, and so you have the reality of dealing with statecraft and nation building and community building in a world where, well, he calls it the world of necessity, but a world where sin and evil exist, right? So it's one of these things. There's like theory in the real world. And so in the real world, you have states that are organized to bring organized violence to protect their people. And then the instantiation of these states combined with certain, historical realities, with the church being now in partnership with the state to create a just and a good society, then begins to create, in a sinful world, certain problems develop, just because power is power, money is money, and these things do corrupt. And, you get sort of a metastasizing cancer. And at some point, this metastasizing cancer sort of breaks off and becomes its own thing, right? That would be kind of the way that I would look at it, in opposition to, say, Ellul's. I find Ellul's analysis a little too idealistic in that regard. That was sort of the, because like Christianity and Anarchy, I thought was one of his weakest books in any ways. That was just my thought. So,
well, but this is actually, I think, the important pivot we need to take here, because I would object to most of the modern online right's perspective that capitalism is just right wing at all. I don't think it is.
Oh, I don't think it's right wing at all. I think it's profoundly and deeply liberal, and it has much more in common with Marx than it does with a Christian world. Absolutely, 100%
but here's
agree with
the
you.
point, right? So how this works, this is where we can sort of jump from the Ellul's critique that I just mentioned to, I think, a deeper misunderstanding the right has of what capitalism is. So this is more of the classic Marxist analysis, but also libertarians made this too. So, example, Rothbard would cite the Marxist economic historian Gabriel Coco. The idea is that certain corporations get special privileges from the state to do things that we can't. Their property is protected by the police, so they externalize the cost of protecting their property, but they privatize the gains because those profits don't come back to the people that paid for the police. And so the idea of the rise of the mega machine, the Roman Empire or the state and then the total state, is the necessary precondition for capitalism in the first place, because there would be no mechanism. There would be no mechanism for the merchant class to externalize the cost of protection onto other people to allow them to socialize costs and privatize gains. And so in that sense, I think it's hard to argue with Ellul and other leftists who make that claim that the state is the prerequisite for capital, and that becomes a problem. And then
the state also creates the greater scale of the state creates a greater abstraction in society, and then in a sense depersonalizes the economic relationships and removes the role of fundamental morality from economic relationships. It becomes simply about the laws of economics and not the laws of economics become their own morality. And it's right. It's the scale of the state that allows that to happen.
Yeah. And so what many on the right, including Spandrell and Nick Land, I think, and Nick Land really ought to know better because he was a Baudrillard Marxist bro.
He was a left. Back in the day. Even in Boyce's interview with him, he identifies himself as a leftist still.
Yeah. So the point is, though, the right has this habit of thinking that markets and capitalism are just a part of reality. So the ethno-nationalists will say that, like, for example, racial biodiversity is just a fact of life. We just have to deal with that and then, look at that clear-eyed and then make laws and organize society around that fact. And they root that in some sort of objective, biological, external reality. Many on the right view markets as like that, but they're not.
Yeah, which they're not.
They're not. So if you go to Scythia, in the year 600 BC, there's no stock markets, there's no banks, there's no, they had barter, there was some exchange, but we didn't have markets. See, they want to treat this as an objective aspect of reality, like physics or biology.
Well, yeah, like it's part of God's created order and it's inviolable.
Yes. And it's not, right? And so I think that this is, the key mistake of the trichotomy. The religious element and the ethnic element, one could argue are objective reflections of human experience.
Far more coherent.
Yeah, but it feels shoehorned when you put in this mercantile class. Like that one, first of all, if you actually follow ethno-nationalist literature, like the alt-right in the very beginning, they were highly critical of the merchant class. And then of course the actual fascists and Nazis were also very critical of the merchant class. So I don't even know why they're here. And I think part of this misunderstanding arises from the fact that they are under the misguided apprehension this is just a part of reality rather than something constructed by some humans to enrich themselves. And so I think that is, I guess, where Marx can be helpful because he says, well, Absolutely. No, this isn't a part of, objective human experience. And I think this is also why the three trichotomy elements don't really hold together. Because if you look at the logic of capital to commodify everything, there's no reason why it should be in favor of ethnic homogeneity. In fact, ethnic homogeneity is dangerous to capital because it allows for effective labor organizing. There's the Whole Foods heat map where they say we want to have a diverse workforce so it reduces rates of unionization. So actually, The logic of capital is opposed to a homogeneous society.
Absolutely.
And Absolutely. So I don't understand why these would even be on the same side. I don't understand why you'd think that.
Well, and this is the thing too, and Schmidt was very conscious of this as well too, in this regard, that this is why he called America an anti-state. He says that, if a state is an expression of a people's desire to secure their existential future, whatever's going on in the U.S., that's not what's happening there. It's in a sense, it's an abstraction. So it's more, in a sense, it answers the question of how do we manage the affairs within this territory, this geographic boundary, And a lot of it ends up being of, how do we create as much freedom for people to manage their economic affairs as free as possible from government interference, and it has much more to do with economic relations than it does with securing the future of a people. So in a sense, there really is no one looking out for people. That in many ways, and this is what I think a lot of Americans especially don't understand, is that the American state, maybe even from the outset, was never really designed to protect Americans. It was designed to ensure the smooth. I don't know if anyone sat down and said it this way, that it was designed to secure the smooth operation of capital, but it really was designed to keep the government out of people's affairs. And what they meant by keeping out of my affairs is to keep out of my economic affairs, so I can kind of run my business the way I see fit. And in that regard, then, I think the interesting thing I've been finding as of late is that we generally tend to focus politically on the state as being the problem, when in fact, really, we should be focusing on economic relationships much more so, because economics tends to drive, as you say, the state exists in a sense to pass costs off onto. So, I've made this on Twitter before, that the global American empire is a commercial empire that's backed with American hard military power. Sort of carrier groups make, just-in-time delivery and manufacture is made possible by American carrier groups. Well, those corporations are not necessarily paying for those carrier groups. Those are passed on. I mean, in some sense, they do pay some taxes, I suppose, right? But the bulk of that cost is passed on to the American citizen, who are then paying for the carrier groups to maintain commercial relations. Then you have all these wars that are driven throughout the world for largely commercial reasons, and those are paid for by the American people, and the gains are realized by the corporations, and the costs are passed off onto the American people. So if you're looking for a culprit, and this is, I think, where the big psyop, like, you talk about Rush Limbaugh, where, we just got to get the state off of people's back and we can let business be free. This is, I think, there's that huge boomer mindset that the business and the economy, that's the good guys, and the state are the bad guys. And if we could just get rid of the state, then the good guys could flourish, and all the rest of us, we could grow rich together. Right. And I think that is, in a sense, but that's not a right-wing idea. That's a fundamentally liberal idea.
Yeah. The other thing too, the other part of the trichotomy here, the theonomist, again, from the point of view of capital, that's not good either, because what the religious element does is it creates sacred time. So you have the idea where you can't engage in commercial activity. We used to have blue laws. Yeah. We used to have blue laws all over this country where you'd close on Sunday.
In Canada, they actually called it the Lord's Day Act.
Yeah.
In Ontario.
And so ultimately, who's responsible for eroding that religious principle in government, in social life? Well, it's corporations, because they didn't want to lose money on those days they weren't allowed to work, right? Because of the blue laws. And so I would argue that because of the way Spandrell and then later Nick Land have constructed the trichotomy, whatever else I might think about the validity of it, it's going to blow up on its own necessarily, because, they're either called techno-accelerationists or like capitalists. They're kind of like, I guess, what you might call crypto
techno-capital optimists in that sense. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And so techno-capital. Yeah. Well,
because then you have it's like you have the meritocracy. Like, we're not going to get to Mars unless we have the best and brightest, right? But it all comes out of that same sphere together. We got to get American business back on track. I think even like Nick Andreessen said this. We just got to get back to making really great products again, right? You do realize that created the spiritual void that led to DEI and wokeness in the first place, right? So you still don't have an answer for the nihilism question.
Well, but what ultimately though is whatever the interests of the theonomist faction or the ethno-nationalist faction are, they're going to be diametrically opposed to both the techno-capital faction, because what it wants is going to necessarily be opposed to what the other two want. And so I would argue that this thing is a ticking time bomb from its construction, that it just can't hold together. And so Nick Land and Benjamin Boyce are arguing, or appearing to argue that this is the result of agent provocateurs and people that just can't learn to sit down and get along. When in fact, this is actually a set of, it's like the Soviet Union in the 90s. There were logical contradictions that brought down the communist system. Well, there are logical contradictions within this system that are now blowing up. And I think what's happening here, what's happening here is Nick Land is trying to do damage control. He's like, this is getting out of control, boys. And it's like, well, it was always going to end up something like this.
Well, and I think that there is this mistaken idea that these three, the trichotomy, have a common enemy. And I think that's another one of these fundamental problems, because I don't necessarily see the optimists as being fundamentally opposed to power or economics. That really what they do is they want to make power work well, right? And now you could say that the nationalists, in a sense, are. I'm not necessarily certain one way or the other whether the nationalists are really opposed to state power. They are well. My guess is that in many ways, it's the conviction that if we focus on our own people, we can make capitalism and technology and everything work well again. Once we have the best and brightest are really our people, and if we put them in charge, it'll all work again. And that's, in a sense, I think where that comes from. And so, in a sense, the techno-futurist and the ethno-nationalists are in many ways aligned, because they both believe in the fundamental sort of, the base economic capital system, but also then in human progress. The real thorn in everybody's side is, well, you could say the theonomists, but the just Christians more broadly, in a sense, because they do actually have a book that just doesn't let them escape from the idea that, the way we conduct our economic affairs. I mean, I know there are some guys who do try to make the case that capitalism is biblical. I just, for the generally, I kind of laugh that whole thing off. But once you begin to open the scriptures and look at sort of the interpersonal nature of justice and economics, it's very hard to make the case from a Christian perspective that, modern hypercapitalism is in any way biblical or the way God intended the world to operate. And so, that creates, then you have a sort of a bug in the system that you simply can't get rid of. Either you squash or eliminate the Christian, or you marginal, and that's been the answer up till now, is that you marginalize them and keep them out of the main of politics. You basically keep them downscale and out of the halls of power. But now they've been sort of flexing themselves and they want a seat at the table, but that doesn't quite work.
Well, this actually, I think what we're getting at here is what I would want to call a bipolar mindset on the right, where, and you mentioned this, where once the state then establishes capitalism, the idea that there's the rule of law is one thing, there's the rule of the market, which is another, and never the two shall meet, right? So what happens is you have all these right-wing guys that when they put on their, monopoly man hat, believe in the law of the market, and they just do that. And, most of us who aren't in business with them don't see that side of them because we're just not in business with them, right? But then when they do streams like us today, right? Or when they meet people in public, they put on their other hat. And the thing is, they say and do things in both worlds that are actually incompatible and contradictory to a unified persona or to a unified sense of ethics. They'll be like, well, I would never do this kind of thing. But then if you look at their business practices, they do it all the time. They just don't see it because they've redefined it away somehow. So they're not doing the thing that they say they would never do. And so you have this kind of like,
yes, exactly.
You have this built-in bipolarity where you have essentially two different men living in the same man. One who's homo economicus, who does what he does when he's at work in the market, and then or investing. And then you've got, the man on the street, John Doe, who's looks very different.
Well, he goes to church on Sunday. He's an elder in his church.
Yeah.
He teaches Sunday school classes, and he might even be like a proud, member of his ethnic group, and he never, other than a handful of guys who do kind of get it and realize that they're trapped in a system that hey, I've got to pay the bills, you know what I mean? And I'm good at this. I know it's, does God really approve of what I'm doing? Probably not, but it pays the bills and I get it, and it's unsustainable and it's undermining our thing, but I don't have a better option. You know what I mean? So there are some guys who are honest about this, you know what I mean? And who recognize that they're caught and don't know what to do to get out of it, because they're in a sense, like everybody, and this is the thing that Schmidt again notes too, because I have to pay the bills in that regard. At least that's what we tell ourselves anyways. I got to pay the bills. But then they wear that, like you say, they wear that other hat. And on this hat, they're loyal to their people. They're loyal to their church. They have a rich devotional life, and they are genuinely good and nice people, and these two worlds exist, but that same guy Monday to Thursday, he'll lay off 1,000 workers without batting an eye because it's, loss of economics.
Or if you're competing for a promotion, he'll use any underhanded tactic to get the promotion and sideline you. Right. So there's that element to it.
And then come to you in the office and say, we need to pray over this afterwards.
Yeah.
I say, yeah. I had that kind of, like, dude, are you listening to yourself?
I will say this, to be fair to Nick Land, he does admit the contradiction of his position. Benjamin Boyce said,
it's like very straight out. He says Benjamin this is a contradictory position.
You guys are basically anti-liberal liberals that are trying to save the liberal project. And he's like, yeah, you're right. That's who we are. And it's like, okay, I mean, you're honest. I mean, I will give you that. I will give you that, Nick. You are honest. I have some disagreements, but I appreciate the honesty here. And I think ultimately, when it comes to why doesn't the right have a thinker like Marx, which is how this all got started.
Yeah.
Well, one thing is we can't. You can't just create this out of whole cloth, right? Whoever this guy should be or will be in the future, it's not going to you can't just wave a magic wand and make him come out of nowhere. Now, we're not need to go into the conditions that led to Marx, but for whatever reason, Marx was who he was. He wrote what he wrote, and he inspired all of these other leftist thinkers and activists.
But Marx was writing within a context. Like Marx just didn't happen, boom, like in a vacuum.
Yeah.
He needed Hegel, he needed Kant, he needed like Schiller, he needed all these guys ahead of him to create the context where Marx did what he did.
Okay, so here's the thing. Here's my controversial theory as to why the right doesn't have such a man, specifically in the modern West, right? The modern West, and this has been one of my major critiques, especially in the United States, the right just doesn't believe in higher education. You get made fun of, you want to go to college, you got to learn something useful, so STEM or finance or whatever. And if you do anything else, well, that's just underwater basket weaving. And whereas the left is like, well, no, we're going to do music, we're going to do art, we're going to do all of this stuff and then create this cultural artifacts and then shift Europe and America in a certain direction. So you need to have a certain kind of literate population that engages in philosophy and theorizing and writing. One of the things you hear a lot, there's that I heard of this from Louis C.K., which apparently he heard. This joke actually comes from I forget that guy who's supposed to be the lookalike of Alex Jones, but he was a comedian. He said that when he went into the flyover country, he was reading a book, and they're like, "Oh, we have a reader over here. Oh, you got a reader? Why are you reading?" And the guy's like, "Well, because I like to read." And so many in America, and I can't speak for Europe, but certainly in America, if you're in the red state countries, they don't really value that. They make fun of you for that, and so you don't really have a culture that could produce a theorist like Marx, because all the steps you have to pass through, like you say, it doesn't come out of a vacuum; it comes out of a culture. It's all subsumed into economics. We're just going to defund education. We're just going to give people trade jobs, and that's how we're going to fix America. I'm like, well, but you still need to have colleges and universities. And like, no, we'll just defund them and just have everything privatized, and we'll just continue to work in the market. And I think that's in part why this the schizophrenic man.
Wow, and I think it even in some ways goes deeper than that, because being pro-market was seen as being quote unquote conservative, right? So you have a psyop there, but this is the kind of thing where, once you begin to get into the literature and you begin to look back, like you have the sort of, the post-war consensus, right? This thing that, Hitler becomes an avatar for evil. But nobody realizes is that you can critique Hitler from the right, but you're not allowed, but there's a sense of, because everything that is on that side of the world is basically, well, it's all Hitler. It's all like evil. So conservatism becomes a version of liberalism. And so you have two versions of liberalism battling itself out, and there really is no conservatism. And so you have people who are in favor of, the economic system, they can go education, but the people who are actual right wingers, in a sense, and the response to the theonomists and to real devout Christians was basically to ghettoize them and not give them a thing. I think, and Christians, for whatever reason, have wanted to support the main empire as their project, in a sense. So being a good Christian means being a good American. And so a lot of times, if you do get educated as a young Christian man, you go off to the big city, and instead of coming back and serving your Christian people, you become a servant of the empire. Even if you hold on to you do like the thing that Nick Land talks about, you become a crypto Christian working in the Fortune 500 company or government, because you're not really allowed to be a devout Christian, like not that kind of Christian, right? But so you've largely then you have that brain drain out of that the group that would be most likely to have a conservative thinker have basically sent all of their best and brightest off to serve the empire, because that's what you do when you're a good American, rather than keeping them at home. Yeah.
Well, and again, earlier modern conservative thought, right, as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and capitalism, you have, they were critical of capital. So you have Justus Moser, a German jurist from Onsbrock, who became
Carlyle.
Yeah, Carlyle, of course, he's the big one. And yeah, they're very critical of all this, and they're, conservatives, right? They're not revolutionaries or anything like that. And so part of this is the modern right has become a kind of slave to Homo economicus at the expense of like theory and philosophy and education, which the left still does.
And they've been neutered by the empire as a result.
Yeah. And because they don't do this, the right lacks the means by which to create such thinkers. So for example, Karl Marx himself was subsidized by Engels, right? And so, to actually have that level of output, that's your full-time job. Okay, you don't do a 9 to 5 and then theory sell on the side. No. That's your full-time job, right? And so the modern right thinks that, well, you can do both. No, you can't actually do both. And the last 200 years has shown us you can't do both. And the left knows this, which is why they have the vanguard that they pay to be both thinkers and activists. And the right just can't do that.
Well, and in many ways, those that, far too many of those who have the money and the means are still, unfortunately, far too committed to the system of capital that gave them the money and means to support it. So you don't have, in a sense, like a landed aristocracy, right? That might then, the vestiges of the landed aristocracy whose wealth didn't come from capital, or only came in part from capital or recently from capital, these types of things, where now, in a sense, if somebody's paying you to write, you're bought and paid for. Well, if you're being paid by capitalists and industrialists who are like the money guys, so yeah, you're looking for your Teal bucks, but Teal isn't servicing, his project is not in any way right wing. It's not anti-regime. He wants the regime to work right. And so there is this sense. It just all of a sudden occurred to me, sort of middle of we were talking about, that in many ways, the problem that the right has, it's almost like saying like the problem of parenting. Okay. So people talk about, well, you've got to have quality time with your kids, right? So you think, wow, we'll schedule a couple hours on Saturday and we'll have quality time with your kids. Well, it doesn't work that way, because everybody might be, the kids may not want to play. They might, you know what I mean? But what happens is when you spend time with your kids, quality time emerges as an accident of time. So in a sense, a right-wing vanguard emerges in the same way. You can't just fund one smart guy and think like now you've got quality time and that's going to do it. You have to invest in a whole class. And I do think in part it does begin somewhat with your intelligentsia. But you basically see a whole class, and out of that whole class emerges leaders, it emerges thinkers, and we're just not doing that right now, largely because the system has been very, very good at either marginalizing us or co-opting us.
Well, yes, I would agree with all that. Now, the other thing is, and starting with the children point, the reason why all of these things are harder to do now is techno-capital has restructured our social relations so that we don't. So 200 years ago, if you lived on a farm, you didn't have to worry about spending quality time with the kids. That was just a given, both at work and play. Your society was organized that it was possible without any extra effort on your part. We've flipped it. We've created a society where all the social relations are.
That's a good point.
All the social relations are meant to serve capital and technology. Yes. And so it takes a great amount of intentional effort to reroute any of those relations back to your spouse or your children or your community.
It's hard. Yeah. I have 6 kids. It's hard. I know.
Well, that's why it's hard, right? It's hard because 200 years ago, society was structured around the family as the central principle. So it wasn't hard, right? I mean, everything was aligned that way on purpose. And part of the reason why Christians, it's the worst of both worlds for Christians today because they've been marginalized, but they still live within a system that makes it harder to create the social bonds that we purport to want, right? So they're not, right, it's the worst of both worlds. And so it leaves them in this.
And they support their enemies too, because they're supporting the world that undermines their desire to build a stable household for themselves and their children, where they could root sort of, and the household. And that's the thing is like others have noticed the breakdown of the household as the central organizing, both, social, economic, and political organization in society.
Absolutely.
And so, if capital has undermined this and you're in charge of capital, basically you're in favor of the very people that are destroying your own ability to organize politically as communities against the system.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of layers here, but to wrap this up into a simple concept, the right refuses to allocate the resources to create an environment under which such a thinker like a Marx could develop and then write the sort of, manifestos and treatises that are needed to create that. Now, for whatever reason, the left was willing to do that and the right isn't. And that's the material cost answer why it doesn't happen. Now, then the other thing is, well, actually, this becomes a really interesting problem, right? Because then what would be the unifying right-wing thought? Because as we've spent a lot of time talking about, the techno-capital accelerationist types aren't right-wing at all.
And they're left-wing.
It feels like entryism, to be honest. It feels like, beginning with Moldbug and then even Land and others, it feels like entryism, where this is a group that doesn't belong. Because I can understand how like a theocratic society, the theonomists, or a ethnically homogeneous society, the ethno-nationalists, could even work together. I could see that. They don't have, mutually incompatible goals. No, but I just don't see how this third group fits. It's like it's shoehorned in here, and it really just feels like entryism. I don't really know how else to say it.
Yeah, and this is a fundamental problem. And the thing is, though, too, and in this regard, see, the funny thing is that there's a long 2,000-year history of Christian thought. It doesn't always necessarily agree, but we have one unifying text, and that's the Bible. But the Bible is also, in a sense, has been maligned as sort of downscale. Nobody takes that seriously, right? And so you can look at it as a piece of literature, but nobody looks at it as a book that makes fundamental claims. I think many people see like Plato and Aristotle, Machiavelli, as making more fundamental claims on us and our lives than does the scriptures. That's the kind of thing is for personal satisfaction. If you get something out of it, that's good for you, but don't bring that into the public sphere, right? That's I think there is, And so you have the potential, like there is a possibility of a unifying text, right? But the unifying text has been so undermined that, and so it's one of those things that, like, even for Christians, like, you'll see very few people, like some do try, but the efforts are less than satisfactory. Let's put it that way. So it really is a problem. Like you say too, Todd, it's just, we haven't reached a critical mass of investment in the type of leadership, you haven't created enough, like, to foment the kind of person, like how many, like 2, 3, 4 centuries of this. And many of this on the left happened organically, right? So, right. So now you're trying to re-engineer something that happened organically on the left. And I'm not sure that it can even be re-engineered. That's the chat. Like that's sort of the thing that in the back of my mind is, can it even be engineered? Can you even do this? That's the, and yet at the sales time, like I have argued this, that I think that in the end, because the state looks to take the position of God in society, to take that role, it's the thing within which we live and move and have our being, that ultimately, when the conflict does flare up, it in the end will be a religious conflict. And so I think that at its heart, that Christianity, and because that's why it's not Hinduism or like Islam or anything, because Christianity is the religion of the West, and this is a Western problem. And once it reaches a crisis point, it's fundamentally going to be a religious war, Christianity versus the state. And that's kind of the way I framed it. And I think the other two groups will probably drift over, because I think the ethno-nationalists, even though there can be, as you say, even though there might be a natural affinity with Christians in that regard, I think dispositionally they're more inclined towards, they have more sympathies, say, with the techno-futurists than they do with the Christians.
Oh, I would agree.
And so I think both of those would drift over to basically supporting the regime against the Christians in that regard.
Right. So there's a few things here. One thing I want to say before I forget, the other reason why the right keeps losing is they don't understand Baudrillard's idea of simulation and the drift of the sign and the signal. So they they live in a world that is highly in flux. It's always changing. But they do understand there's these deep truths that govern the universe. And so what they do is they do a lot of mismatching. They look at certain things and think, oh, this is a reflection of the eternal truths of the true, the good, and the beautiful. And it's like, no, actually, it's not.
Sorry. No, it's just an illusion. Sorry.
That's a big part of it, right? So what they do is they get lost in the illusion, and they can't realize that what they're holding on to is part of a very revolutionary system, rather than what they thought as an expression of this true historical, that
stands outside of the system.
Yeah.
Right. And so you want to make Christianity. Yeah. So to use an example, say maybe of like 40K, right? If you're, I did a Substack note about this, right? Left versus right, it's all in a sense, you could look at it as like two different armies within 40K, right? Well, who's dominating the meta today, right? Well, Christians want to, in a sense, many Christians want to insert Christianity as a new army within 40K. And the problem is that then you're playing 40K, and 40K sets the rules. And even if you dominate the meta, you're still playing 40K.
Yes.
Whereas in a sense, what you really want to be doing is, to use the game analogy, you want to be playing Dungeons and Dragons. You don't want to be playing 40K. And so the Christians have to understand that you have to stand apart and develop your own game rules, like your own system of rules, your own games. And as you say, too, with simulacra and simulation, you have to ground your own rules in your own way, or the system will set the parameters for it. And it will assimilate your stuff into the simulation that it's running, into its game. And it will co-opt and neuter you and make you part of the game. Absorb. Yeah. Right. Now, and that's one of the things that the system does very, very well.
Yes. Is
that it absorbs and just, co-ops, integrates. That's the word I was looking for. It integrates all of these outside it wants to integrate all of these outside elements into the system. So it'll do things like, and this is something Ellul notes in the Political Illusion, right? You think yourself as an activist group that you are, lobbying for your particular, say you've got a Christian activist group and you're lobbying for the thing. Well, once you start lobbying the government, somebody in the thing say, hey, that's a really good policy. Maybe you can come here and write something up for us and develop some legislation. Well, now your lobbying group is no longer apart from the government. It's now part of the system. So you are actually part of the government. And so by participating in lobbying, you become part of the system, part of the game. And this is, I think, a lot of Christians don't go deep enough into. And this is why I find Elul to be very, very valuable, because you have to go deeper beneath all of these surface phenomenon to understand how the system itself actually works, and is always working to integrate elements that are potentially chaotic and disruptive, and then integrate them into the system and conform them to the rules of the system.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another one of the big problems that they face. But to your point about the ultimate fate of the trichotomy, these elements in it, and riffing off what I've said as well, I think that I've said this publicly before. If you wanted to have a sort of quasi-neutral figure who could be a right-wing, quote, Marx, it wouldn't be an exact fit because he's so old. It wouldn't really describe a lot of modern stuff. But Aristotle, he's sort of a practical, pragmatic kind of guy that I think most right-wing people could get behind. But again, he's 2,500 years old. This isn't going to really accurately necessarily describe the new conditions we're living with. And then to your point, yeah, Christians, we have Jesus, we have the Bible. I think ultimately what that's going to mean is there's going to be this, you're going to have the techno-futurists on one side, and the theonomists on the other. And then that's going to be the ultimate tension on the right, as the rest of the country goes the way it goes. And what I think that means is through pressures of selection, only the theonomists will be left. The other two
That's kind of it.
The other two groups, the other two groups cannot find a unifying principle. They can't. Now, the techno-futurists just don't have one. It's, it's the future hope. It's very Marxian, right? It's the future hope of, and what'll happen is they'll over time, as these pressures we're talking about are working, they'll be undermined. Now, you might say the nationalists have a unifying principle of race, but that's not a unifying principle of thought. That's not going to guide your action.
That just tells you who you're fighting for.
Yeah, it just tells you who you're fighting for. It might give you some policy goals, but it won't. You're not going to develop a political theory just from accepting race is real. So what's going to happen probably is that they'll have to make a choice. Are they going to go to the techno-futurist side, or are they going to go to the theonomist side? And so what I think will happen, broadly speaking, is the ethno-nationalist faction will start to split. Some will become Christian, some will become techno-futurist, and then we'll have just two poles. And then what will happen is over time, because there's nothing to hold together the techno-accelerationists, they'll just disintegrate. And all you'll have left are the theonomists by default, because they just outlasted all the opposition. Now, how long that'll take or what it'll look like when we get there, I don't know. But those are my predictions.
Yeah, and I think there are also some fundamental transformations that need to happen, because again, it was transformations within Christianity that helped bring us to this point. And I don't even think it was intentional necessarily. Nobody did it with malign intent. It was just one of these things that happened historically. But I do think that there's going to have to be because it comes back to the authority problem, right? The question of where does authority come from? So I think that there is going to have to be a reintegration of what you might call mystery or the mystical tradition to reintegrate that in, and maybe sacramentalism, although that's kind of one of these things that exists in both Protestants and also Catholics and as well as Orthodox, depending on which denominational stream you're in. But it's one of these things where I think that Protestantism, to really become an effective opposition, is going to have to reintegrate the mystical tradition back into its more rational, systematic theology, sort of stripped down, the whitewashed church type of approach, and to broad, because that enables it to become, in a sense, a full system, in a sense that's properly grounded again. Because that's the problem with Protestantism right now, is it's not properly grounded. At least that's my mind. You know what I mean? And people say, well, it's grounded in the word, but there's we could do another couple hours on hermeneutics and blah, 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 and that would get us, well off field. But I think that the Christian opposition to the state system is not there yet, in a sense, because they also too have to reject their love of capital. But I think that's far more possible for the Christian than it is for the techno opposite, the techno. And I think in some way, some of that may be forced on the Christians by the regime, that in a sense, they'll be punished for hanging on to their faith.
Well, let me put it this way. Yeah. Given the pressures that we're talking about, the ethno-nationalist branch of the trichotomy and the techno-accelerationist branch of the trichotomy, they have no means within themselves to reflect and think and produce something new to deal with these challenges. The theonomist branch does. It's the scripture. We have
scripture and tradition.
And so the thing is, even if they're not doing it now, they have the potential to do so under the appropriate conditions. And
that's right.
And you said this before during the show, and I think you're right. There will be a set of conditions that are imposed on Christians at some point in the future, which will compel them to go back to their word, to their history, and say, okay, how do we as Christians, while remaining faithful to what we stand for, deal with these new challenges? And you see, nobody else in this trichotomy will be able to deal with those challenges, because either A, like the techno-futurists, they like all of this stuff and they can't actually criticize it, and they'll just be left scratching their heads like, why is this happening? Or like the ethno-nationalists, they just won't have a coherent set of thought. They'll just split between the other two.
Yeah. Well, I think there we go. We've been at it now. We covered a lot of ground, Todd. I really appreciate you coming on and just the back and forth, and just it's really good to kind of work out some things and just to bounce them off you and to get your feedback and whatever too. This has been very, very helpful for me as well. So thank you for coming on and just being a conversationalist here. Where can people find you if they want to look for you?
Yes. First, thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure as always. You can find me on my YouTube channel, Praise of Folly Podcast, and you can follow me on X at POF Podcast. And just swing by. Very good. Again, thank you. And I hope all of you are doing well. God's blessings to you all.